So welcome back. Thank you for coming back. So I now want to introduce the next panel, which is basically about the practice of journalism. And seeing as we're in a journalism school, that's probably not a bad thing to do. So let me welcome Jay Rosen. And he's going to lead this discussion amongst a pretty great group of people, one of whom is one of our Tao Fellows, Sarah Watson, which we're very excited about, who's come here all the way from Singapore, and John Herman and Julia Agwin. So they're going to talk about the technology beat. Are journalists actually covering this relationship between journalism and Silicon Valley adequately?
Well, thank you very much, Claire. And thank you to the Tao Center for organizing this day on a very important subject. We're going to be talking to beat writers, beat reporters, and critics in this panel. And ordinarily when we discuss beats at Columbia J School, we talk about stories and sources, and we'll, I'm sure, get into that stuff. But what I told the panelists I wanted to start with is something a little bit deeper than that. I want to know about core beliefs and questions of purpose in writing about technology, and that's what I told them to prepare themselves for first. So first we're going to find out a little bit about how these writers define their beats, and then we're going to move on to story sources and what's wrong with technology journalism the way it's normally done and the technology coverage that we need. Right, Julia?
I have a lot to say on that.
Let's start with you. Julia is an investigative reporter, ProPublica. She spent 13 years at the Wall Street Journal. She was largely responsible for the What They Know series, which was the first time that I really started tuning into tracking because it was such a great piece of work. You say you cover technology as an investigative reporter, Julia, but how would you define your personal beat?
It was funny when you sent that email saying we were going to talk about our beats, because I had reached this point in my career where I was hoping I had finally surpassed having a beat. But no, I actually do have a beat, but it's a different one than I started with. I'm always a traditional tech reporter, writing about technology. And at ProPublica, I have a really nice broad mandate, which is basically right now privacy and surveillance, but it's anything where I can use my expertise about technology to talk about society. So the idea that technology is its own world is really no longer true. Technology pervades everything that we do. And so every reporter needs expertise in technology. If you're in healthcare or if you're covering the auto industry, actually tech is everywhere. So I think of myself as somebody who is really interested in using just my own expertise, because I grew up in Palo Alto and I learned to program in 5th grade, and I'm computer literate only in the sense of like the low bar of journalism and computer literacy, not in the actual sense of computer literacy. But I feel like that competitive advantage is really what core thing that motivates me. And so for instance, I like to do things that are just really geeky, like sniff internet traffic and see what data is going where and places that might be surprising. And so I guess I see myself as using the tools that I have that I think are unique to me to find stories that others wouldn't be able to find. And sometimes they're about technology specific subjects, but sometimes they're not. You know, I did a story in August about Princeton Review, had different pricing for its products, for its online tutoring products. If you put in your zip code, you got a different price for each zip code. So that's not a technology story, but because it's big data and it required a lot of technology to analyze it, we were able to analyze it and show that zip codes with higher proportions of Asians were much more likely to get higher prices. So I think of that as something that I can use my tech expertise, but it's not a tech story.
So in the technology beat, the way that you do it, Julia, who are you trying to be loyal to?
You know, that's an interesting question. I always actually feel a little bad about my beat. I feel sorry for myself sometimes because I'm like, I don't have a natural constituency. There's not like a bunch of people out there who are like, you know what? You got to figure out what is going on with the Princeton Review. Nobody said that, actually. And even after we wrote the story, everybody was like, that was a weird story. I don't know what to think about that. It's like, it was unintentional discrimination. And we have so much intentional discrimination in this society that in fact people are like, unintentional discrimination I can barely get myself worked up about. And so, so I sometimes feel like I'm not sure, I don't have a natural audience I'm playing to, but I guess what I think of my motivating purpose is I want to illuminate things that people don't know are happening. Because we aren't yet a particularly tech literate society, there are a lot of things that look to the outside like magic, and they're not. They have human motivations behind them, and I just want to reveal those to people.
Okay, good. John, I'm a reader of yours, so I know a bit about what you do. The All calls you the series that you've been working on, the content wars. That would be one way of describing what you focus on. In your latest piece, you summarize it as tech is eating media. But I'd love to know, how do you define the subject that you've been tracking in the work that you've been doing over the last few years?
The content wars name it sort of started as a joke. It was an offhand comment. I think before things really took off, and then now I talk about it and people reference it totally seriously, and I'm sort of stuck with it. So that's sort of the beat. I guess it's the platform beat, and now that makes sense as a beat because we have a lot of ascendant platforms. The conversation is focused on a small handful, and I think before very long that'll be an incoherent beat. It'll be too big, so people will be carving out beats within the platform beat. Maybe they won't. Maybe describing something as a platform beat would be like describing it as the capitalism beat, and I cover banks within the capitalism beat. So I think that's sort of where things are now.
Okay, so in the platform beat, which may not exist in a couple of years for reasons you've explained, in the platform beat, the way that you do it, what is at stake?
I'm coming from a position of writing about, I guess, first the media industry. That was the natural audience for the All, and then for a lot of the things I was writing. And I'm this could just be bias from covering this for so long, but I feel like a lot of what's happening in media applies elsewhere in the economy. It's a good place to sort of attempt understanding dynamics of platforms and partners and what a truly dominant platform means for an industry, what it means to be a partner versus to be a user. I guess the most extreme claim at what's at stake is that to the extent that the tech industry will be a part of the economy and influence other parts of the economy and potentially sort of overtake the economy as a central influence, platforms for the next who knows how many years are a part of that plan and a part of that reality. Like that's how the tech industry is sort of manifesting its ideologies, its plans, its biggest ideas. They are platforms. So a lot, I guess.
Sarah, I would classify you as a technology critic, more than a beat reporter. But
as I do myself.
You kind of have a beat as a critic. I do as a critic. I feel I have a beat. So what's yours?
So I want to talk about kind of two pieces of it because on the kind of things that I write for The Atlantic or Wired or Al Jazeera or Gizmodo are very much kind of what you might call a traditional beat of saying, I'm covering a personal technology view of how we live with technology. And arguably, I'm writing from the position of the user. And so I'm drawing a lot on kind of ethnography and situated knowledge and trying to understand how users interpret what they're interacting with. And so that's kind of always been my goal in particular in how I think about the audiences that I'm writing for is like, I want people to figure out how to be critical about their interactions with technology. And so some of that's just modeling inquiry into our relationship. And then on the other side, the kind of meta level is what I'm doing here at the Tao Center, which is my work on looking at how people who might be called technology critics have been covering technology criticism. And that's more in the area of what both Julia and Kate Crawford in the previous panel were talking about in talking about the surfacing the values that are embedded in our technology and kind of the meta questions, the underlying unconscious or conscious ideology and sometimes some of the rhetoric that's applied by these technology companies and by the kind of underlying logic that puts those systems forward. And so I have this kind of strange relationship with the term technology critic, and part of my goal here at the Tao Center is to do a little bit more unpacking as to why that term is problematic. And I think some of it has to do with the fact that the people that you might first come to mind for when you think about technology critics are the types of people like Evgeny Morozov and Nicholas Carr. Maybe Nick Bilton falls into that category in his position at the New York Times. But there's something, especially in kind of the Evgeny Nicholas Carr side of things, there's something inherently either negative or kind of Luddite or contrarian about their coverage, and that falls into the negative criticism sense of the meaning of the word critic. But I think there's still plenty of people out there who are not necessarily calling themselves critics, but are on a slightly more traditional tech beat, which is, you know, writing for The Atlantic or kind of doing the cultural criticism, how do we live with technology? And I think there's value in collating and kind of pointing at what the practice of what they're doing is and trying to elevate some of that, because I think it's really important work.
So tell me if this question makes sense for your work. I think it does, but you would be the judge. What sort of world are you defending in your work?
I'm not sure I'm defending any world, because that is inherently taking somewhat of a Luddite position, maybe. What I think I'm more interested in is, as I said, kind of giving people more of the tools to interrogate the systems that we're interacting with and that are so fundamental in our everyday lives. And so I guess if anything I'm defending is like personal agency and autonomy as these systems that we're interacting with kind of shove the kind of decisions that are being made on our behalf further and further down into a very seamless experience.
Okay. So I would say you're defending a world in which people are capable of being critical about things that are shaping their lives without them necessarily knowing it. So that's the world that you want to bring about through your tech criticism. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some big stories that everybody has been aware of, and I hope when we focus on them, we can ask ourselves what should be and what was the role of tech journalism in covering technology in these stories. So the first one is the whole Snowden story and everything that followed from that. Then we have the startup Theranos, and that I have a ton of questions about that I would love to hear this group talk about. We have platform creep, which is a term that John uses to discuss the whole platform as publisher question that we've been lingering on today. And then Amazon versus the New York Times and that kind of a spectacle. So I'd like to start with the Snowden effect, something I wrote a lot about. My own sense, and I would love to know what you people think, especially since two of you have focused specifically on surveillance. My sense is that the Snowden story, the technology writing, there's kind of like before Snowden and after Snowden, because Snowden was such a huge event, and it brought home how the technology story reaches to the very top of our society, literally like the Supreme Court, and then reaches completely into private life and into bedrooms and homes. And after Snowden, there was like no way of denying that. It was possible to know that before Snowden, but after it was impossible not to know it. That's my own sense of it. But I would love to know what you think. What changed in the technology writing beat with Snowden?
I mean, I'm actually surprised that you say that, because I feel like if you look at if you look at what is technology coverage, which is none of us are actually doing, but the vast majority of what passes for technology coverage is phone reviews. Okay, and then it's TV reviews, and then it's snark about the other person's phone or TV reviews, and or it's publishing press releases about the next phone. 3 seconds before your competitor. So that's like 99% of tech journalism, and so I don't think any of that has changed, actually, and it's sort of strange to me that it hasn't. What has happened is that you insert one person into each one of those sort of content factories for tech reviews that writes a scare story based on a press release about some sort of privacy issue every day, which is good, I guess. But actually, weirdly, the tech press remains completely product focused and actually acts very much like a trade press. It's essentially like back when I was a young reporter, it was the computer world, right? And so even big brands with sort of legitimate budgets and stuff are still doing basically trade coverage.
Right.
So I just had to say that. That was like a little rant. I need to get it off my chest. Now I'm done. We can talk about Snowden. So Snowden, you know, the thing that really resonated for me with Snowden actually was such an indictment of the tech press, right? He had these incredibly technically detailed documents, which really you needed a technologist to understand. He didn't even think about going into the tech press, right? I mean, at all. He went to Glenn Greenwald, an opinion writer who he thought would defend him and would understand the political implications of this data. And then he went to Laura Poitras and then Bart Gellman. All of those people ended up having to hire technologists to decipher the documents. And to me, the moment when each one of them chose a technologist and started working with a technologist was when their coverage elevated dramatically. So there was a real leap in the first round of coverage, which was very much like, there's some slides, they look scary, be scared. And then there was like the technologist got involved and it was like, oh, I now see what this actually is about, right? Oh, we're just taking every single call from Bermuda. Okay, that's awesome. So I think the tech journalists who consulted on that really lifted the coverage, and I would love to have seen much more integration of tech and national security journalism after that. I think The Intercept is probably the place that's doing that the most, and we're doing that at ProPublica. But I didn't see it threading throughout other newsrooms, really.
Mm-hmm. Okay. John, I wonder if you had a thought on that.
I'm not going to defend like the way tech journalism is conducted in general, but I think your definition of tech journalism as like this narrow trade product-focused thing isn't quite right. Now, there was a time when I think that was a great way for a new publication to really like I used to work at Gizmodo, which was very much that kind of place. You know, I did the morning beat where in a different time zone, I'd wake up and write like 4 or 5 posts about press releases, you know, issued in Europe. And that was great for like traffic. There are a lot of people who wanted to talk about these things. Now that kind of coverage has kind of been marginalized. I know a lot of people who still write about that stuff and it doesn't really get an audience. The incentives for doing that aren't really there. So I'm not sure I would say that, I mean, even at a place that still traffics in that type of stories, a place like The Verge, those types of stories, absent the occasional like iPhone review or really big product release, don't really do anything for them. They feel like they have to be there because they've always done it, but their bigger stories are culture stories, stories about policy. At The Verge, you would have you know, probably more traffic on a story from Nilay Patel about net neutrality or copyright than you would get on a review for the newest Samsung phone. So I'm not sure I would say that that's still, there's certainly, if you narrow the definition of the tech press to the tech product press, I mean, then it's kind of a self-fulfilling thing, but I feel like the sites that used to do that are broadening, and I feel like more importantly, publications that used to also sort of dabble in product journalism, which basically includes all of them, are now more aggressively moving into tech coverage. So I mean, I guess I wonder if some of your criticism there is just a product of your definition of a narrow definition of the tech press.
Well, I apologize if that's true. I just, when you look at it, a page from one of those places, the volume that you see on the page is like really product-y, right? So
Well,
maybe
yeah,
the
but
traffic,
front-
I don't have access to the
page,
numbers.
Front page volume is sort of like the 5th most important thing at a news organization now.
Okay, I'm just saying as a viewer, I was like, wow, there's a lot of it.
But
There's
I'm
a huge
suggesting that
river of
that
it.
mode
but
of
I'm
viewership.
happy to be corrected, and I would love it if what you're saying is true. That's great, right?
Well,
It's
I
great
don't
if
think,
that's actually
I don't think the
evolving.
tech press is like doing great. I just mean that I don't think it's doing great in a different way, I guess.
Okay.
Well, I might add something to this mix because I think I agree with both of you, which is that I think a lot of maybe what Julia's referring to is I think there's a limit to kind of the traditional institutions that cover technology in the sense that they still continue to cover technology very much from a section perspective, and so it's the business section and the style section, and that really limits the kinds of questions that get surfaced there. I'm looking at the New York Times, but even on the other side of it, on the critical side of it, even the New Yorker still only just has one technology issue or 2 per year, and that's where they shove all the technology stories once a year, rather than it being a kind of consistent thing that they're drumming on.
Mm-hmm.
I also think, regardless, there's still very much a kind of either it's a progress story, as you point out, or a panic story, and it's kind of we're all going to hell with technology, or it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. And I think that's really still hard to get away from. But also, I also wanted to touch on the question of what about the Snowden coverage was kind of touching on something that's really important. And Julia, to your point about expertise being a really important piece of it, I think I looked to Bruce Schneier, who's a friend of mine from the Berkman Center. I wonder to the extent to which expertise or a certain disciplinary lens is critical to good technology criticism, because I think on the one hand, technology as a subject is kind of a substrate. It's the means to the end, and so it's not, as a news subject, kind of pinning down what technology is really hard. And so oftentimes, in all of these examples, I think for the most part, in the Amazon example, we're not necessarily talking about reporting on technology, but we're reporting on labor. And I think that there's a lot of technology criticism that's good, that's really just taking like the feminist lens on X product, or the kind of social justice lens on the latest scandal. So I think there's a lot of work to be done about. I'm almost arguing for kind of better liberal arts exposure for the kind of beat reporter to be able to ask some of those questions.
A way to say it, Sarah, would be that we don't necessarily need more technology journalism. We need more technology-aware journalists to do good journalism. Right?
Yeah, and I also think the longer term, like not the quick take, but the kind of what does this all mean to us needs to happen with a little bit more
Let's
background.
talk a little bit about this Theranos story, which as a reader, none of you, I don't think, covered it specifically, but maybe you have some insights into this. As a reader, I thought it was very puzzling story. I was grateful for the Wall Street Journal for taking a close look at this company, but I wondered, like, how did this company, which has absolutely no way of proving that its technology works, how did it become what it became? Like, I don't get that. How does that happen? Because it seemed to be a fairly unexamined company before the Wall Street Journal did this, but yet it had like $400 million in capital and stuff. So how does that happen? And how does the company get to that point where it's been the subject of these incredible profiles and these stories without anyone actually taking a hard look at it? How does that happen?
I mean, to me, I think that goes back to the kind of progress narrative. We're so excited about the interesting new thing that this disruptive technology company is going to do, and they're kind of born out of a Silicon Valley mentality. And so that's really easy to just keep reporting on because it's sexy and interesting. And I think the Wall Street Journal is jumping in and actually doing the kind of doing the work of comparing, a disruptive Silicon Valley kind of, we can do anything and we don't have to follow the FDA and we don't have to do, traditional science and we don't have to prove ourselves. And I compare it to like 23andMe a few years ago, right? Like, we think it's really interesting and it could be the future of everything, but until we start comparing it to antecedents, we're not really holding it to public standards.
I think the specific like diagnosis with something like Theranos or 23andMe is that these are companies that fall into maybe a healthcare or health tech sort of beat, but that are receiving funding and support from companies and people that are sort of outside of that beat, which creates kind of a sourcing problem. It's not like people. It's just more work as a reporter, and it's not just more straightforward legwork. It's like resourcing your entire beat, which is a problem in a lot of places. So that might have obfuscated things a little bit. But yeah, they are also they're the kinds of companies, because of this, they easily fall into the like progress or panic narrative, and something like a healthcare company or a biotech company or an energy or a green tech company, those tend to fall into the progress narrative because people just don't have deep expertise in these areas. And so, someone who works with or funds a company like Theranos would say that no, part of the point is that we don't want to have we don't want to conform to FDA regulations that were written for a different type of industry, and we don't want to conduct science in a traditional way. And those are all totally defensible positions if you can deliver on the promise. They are sort of the first major companies, some of the first major companies in their particular space, making their particular claims. So they have the ability to articulate these grand arguments that no one really disagrees with. Like, yeah, blood testing should take less blood. You shouldn't need to send results to a lab. You should be able to do this on a small machine like they do in the movies. Like, of course that's true. Of course everyone wants things to be cheaper and faster. And of course, the widespread accessibility of one's own genetic information seems like a good idea. But that promise is totally divorced from the practice, and that's sort of where this middle between progress and panic narratives would naturally address things.
Mm-hmm. Julie, you have anything on that?
I mean, I guess I would just say it's not necessarily a tech issue, really. It's a business journalism issue, right? I mean, this has happened many times, right? Enron is obviously the best example. And, this is why when I was a reporter at the San Francisco Chronicle, I came here to Columbia to get the Knight Badgett degree and I got an MBA through that program because I was scared of being the journalist who was duped, right? I didn't understand how to read a balance sheet or income statement. And then I wanted to know, how can I make sure I'm holding these companies accountable with the best amount of tools that I have at my disposal? And so there's a business journalism component to this, which is that Columbia has done an amazing job of trying to elevate and increase the skills of business journalists, and I think that is played out. The Wall Street Journal coverage shows that does have some fruits. Whether there was a way to technologically also test this company's claims, I don't know, right? I don't know if that was something you could do. I personally am in the business of all the time trying to get data to test companies' claims. That's what I did with Princeton Review. I scraped their website till God's creation, until it was I had all the data, and then I analyzed it. You can't always do that. You can't always get inside a company to check what they're saying.
Mm. But when you look at the board of that company, it doesn't make any sense.
But that's true of a lot of boards.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's what I'm asking.
Well, you mentioned a fear of getting duped, and that's a real fear. But honestly, I think there's probably a more powerful fear now of being on the wrong side of things or being left behind. When everyone's very excited and exuberant about new technologies and the promises of new technologies, particularly when you have companies articulating such grand visions for how things should be. Like Uber isn't really talking about being a car company. The way they talk about themselves is as a company that's going to revolutionize how cities work, logistics, what labor is. Airbnb and my favorite rendition of this whole story and what it means is on Benjamin Walker's podcast, The Theory of Everything. It's just like a real fundamental change in what the home is as an asset, what how a city is supposed to work. They're talking about this now openly. Their latest slide deck about their recent political victory invokes the Industrial Revolution and this as a sort of different but similar time in history. And so there's this interesting rhetorical complement to that you see in Silicon Valley, and I'm thinking, of course, as many people do when they talk about like public tech arguments, of someone like Mark Andreessen, who very often like points to past criticism as cynicism, as pessimism, and talks about how pessimists are historically always wrong and optimists are historically always right, which is kind of like necessarily true. It's kind of like this. It's kind of a circular, like, yeah, the victors write history. The things that worked, and like they talk about themselves, and we talk about them in that way. Anyway, it's. I forgot where I was going with this, but but anyway, there's definitely a strong incentive as a reporter or a critic to make sure that you are not one of those people who is just saying this is a silly concept. This isn't going to stick around. You don't want to be the guy who wrote about how the internet was a fad. Right. You don't want to be the guy who said that person-to-person home rentals were never going to stick, because like you're probably going to be wrong. It's in the interest of the companies that are doing these things now to associate themselves or to make their claims for their own companies inextricable from the promise of those concepts, and it's the job of reporters and critics to pull those two things apart.
Mm. That's an excellent point.
Yeah.
And part of the reason that I asked you, like, what do you defend? Who are you loyal to? What is the world you're trying to protect here? Is exactly what you're saying, John. If you don't want to be duped on the one hand, but you also don't want to be left behind, which is what you said, it seems to me the way to prevent those things is by having something that that you can measure technology against. And without that, you just become subject to fashion and hype and industry and product cycles and what everyone else is doing. So that's why I started with those questions, because without them, you're kind of lost. All right, let's move on to platform creep. How should technology journalists, how should technology writers and critics approach this this conflict between platforms and publishers? Do you have any thoughts on that? What kind of journalism do we need? What is the platform journalism we need? That's really my question. What is the Facebook, Google, Twitter journalism we need?
If I were in academia, I'd be studying the material relationships between platforms and their partners, both informal partners, as news organizations have been for a number of years now, with Twitter and Facebook, for example, as people who are as organizations that are putting things on those platforms because they return visitors, to the formal relationships that now some media companies are entering into with these platforms, where they are putting things on those platforms and leaving them there, and hopefully extracting not just people, but maybe money. There's real data-driven, data-focused work to be done there, and as a critic who writes about that stuff a lot, I'm not doing it, and I can feel its absence. So that's one thing that we need.
So that's something the Tao Center could help with.
Yeah, I guess.
Sarah, do you have any thoughts on this?
I mean, if I knew the answer to that, I think we wouldn't have this conference, right? I think that's the big, elephant in the room problem to solve. What I do think, and I think in the Theranos example, and even in your work, kind of posting things to Medium, critiquing Medium, or kind of using these platforms that we kind of just use because they're there and the audience is there, and that's the way to get these conversations started, is really tough. And the same is true of using Twitter and using Facebook for these conversations. So I hope that putting it there is going to kind of surface the tension even further. yeah.
I mean, I have like this very luxurious role of just being a journalist who doesn't have to worry about this. So I write my stories. I write critical stories about Facebook. They circulate on Facebook. I mean, luckily, I'm not finding this to be impacting me. Now, it's impacting my organization because we are not ad supported, right? The only way we can do the investigative journalism is by being philanthropic and getting donations. And so by opting out of the ad system, we have a luxurious life that not everyone can share. But so I'm lucky that way. But I also just feel over time that one great thing about the current state we're in now is that there is actually, despite all the pressures on journalism, there's actually a real flowering of journalism. And good stuff is rising to the top on all sorts of platforms. And so I have hope that this will just be another way we distribute our content, and it will end up that the readers want it.
A question for all three of you. With these companies where secrecy is huge, their internal culture is, you don't talk to anyone. They have plans they're trying to keep secret. A lot of times they're working on things and they don't want to say anything about them until they're done. How do you develop sources in these companies when nobody is supposed to talk to you?
I want to know the answer to that because I'm working on a piece about Knowledge Graph right now at Google Knowledge Graph, and I have run in circles trying to figure out somebody who could actually tell me like what happens when you put in feedback to change what the results are on the right side, not the left side of search results when they're summarizing. And I think that's the perfect example of like, I'm trying to critique something about like Google's role in creating knowledge and presenting it as capital K knowledge. And
who is the person
yeah.
in charge of that?
And furthermore, does anyone actually
care.
have an answer? No,
right.
Have an answer, because I imagine that I'm looking at a very specific case to try to kind of open it up, and it may just be that there isn't any one person who can answer how the multiple algorithms are pulling from multiple different data sources and summarizing them and preferencing them.
Yeah, sometimes I think that's one reason why it's so hard to report on these companies, because the answer to a lot of the important questions would be, it's a vast, uncontrolled experiment and nobody has any idea what we're doing.
And we're changing it
and nobody
every
wants
day.
to say that. Yeah,
well, and we're changing it every day. And
yeah, and it changes every day, exactly.
Often
I mean,
the person doesn't exist that you might imagine is there. When you're writing about, say, a new Facebook product that will have an effect on the media industry, or one that's sort of explicitly meant to work with the media industry, like Notify, the people working on a product like that are asking the same questions that these journalists are then showing up and like requesting answers for. And people misunderstand this, I think, because these things are presented as products, and if they're products, then they must be done. And if they work, that must mean that they're right. And I think there's a tendency to think of something like an app or a new addition to a platform, to think of those things a little bit like a new phone. And I mean, even if you do that, a lot of new devices fail because they weren't thought through properly, or just because they made the wrong bet. But I think I'm consistently surprised, I guess less and less so, that when I do get to talk to people who are working on these projects that are going to have huge implications for media or just the way people talk to each other, that they're sort of like, well, I guess we'll find out. Like, we think this is what's going to happen, but we are still struggling to think through the implications for our company and for our most common users. We are no further along than you are in imagining what this means for your industry. Like, why are you asking us about that?
Which is why I don't ask them. I just scrape all their data. So
my version of that is just going to bars. Like, a lot of people who work at tech companies are really young. It's easy to find someone from Facebook at a bar and be like, oh, you work at Facebook? Tell me about it. It's so like.
Right. So I do spend a lot of time at bars also, but I want to say that one story that I think is really relevant to this conversation is when right before the presidential election, Obama versus Romney, Google was actually doing this weird thing where if you looked for Obama, search for Obama, then all your subsequent results had Obama in it. So it was like your next result was like toothpaste, and it was like Obama plus toothpaste. And there was literally like toothpaste, and then 3 things that says Obama plus toothpaste, and then it was like more toothpaste. And it would go out through your browsing session. And when you did this with Romney, there was no subsequent Romney results inserted into your subsequent searches. The way I found this out was somebody gave me a tip. And in order to verify it, I did a mechanical Turk experiment with thousands of people across the country, asked them to search, set up a proxy, took all the data. By the time I brought it back to Google, they were like, huh, that's weird. Why is that happening? And I was like, I don't know, I'm asking you, right? And then they looked into it, and they're like, well, it looks like we trained the data before the election. And I was like, well, you know, I would like to point out to you that presidential elections are 2 years long now, and we're a week away from the November date. So when exactly are you training this data, right? So it is machine learning, right? They just put, but there's not a quality control situation, which is like, I guess we just trained it 2 years ago and Romney wasn't running.
Yeah. We have 3 or 4 minutes left. Let's go to Amazon for a second. The Amazon versus New York Times. The thing that really struck home for me about that episode is that it used to be you published your big series and you just waited for the reactions to come in and the prizes. And now it isn't like that. And increasingly, and I see this, ProPublica does this all the time, increasingly you have to fight for your story after it's published in the public square. And if somebody attacks it, you can't just sit there and say, we stand by our story. You have to actually go out and engage in defense and argument and re-explanation of what you're doing, and sometimes battle, like Jay Carney, for example. So that strikes me as like, that's different. It used to be a situation where journalists did their work, they let everyone talk about it, and they kind of sat back and watched the reactions, and now it's different.
I mean, this is actually this is a great thing, because this is actually what allows great journalism to rise above the rest. If you can survive,
I agree. I think it's a good thing.
If you can survive the boxing match that comes out after your story, like, then you're stronger for it. And if you can't, then maybe it wasn't as great a story. And so I think this is a great thing, because back in the old days, which obviously I sometimes nostalgic for, but then I remind myself of how many unbelievably terrible stories ran that I would read and be like, every single thing in here is untrue, and no one would say anything, because there was no public discourse about these topics. And so I think that this is an unpleasant experience. I don't enjoy it myself. I get pummeled all the time. I'm currently being pummeled by some TV maker named Vizio that's tracking what you're watching. But whatever, you can opt out if you find the setting on your TV. But you know, it's not pleasant, right? They went to the Washington Post and said, I'm giving opinions about their stuff. You know, it's not fun. Opinions.
That's unbelievable.
I do think this is like a great thing that seems like a less great thing for the time being, because in the first instances of with something like Amazon, the Amazon story and Jay Carney going to Medium to talk about it and all this stuff, there's a lot of the audience there and a lot of other commentators are sort of instinctively taking sides, and I'm not sure they all know why they're doing it. There is sort of like a solidarity thing going on where people in the media instinctively are like, the New York Times is the best institution in the world, I'm defending it. They aren't saying that, but that's sort of what they're feeling. And then people, some people I think in the tech industry read this and they're like, Amazon's trying to change the entire world. Like, what the hell are you guys? This is ridiculous. And as this happens more and more, people will either recognize their own tendency to do that, which I guess isn't very likely, but people will recognize others' tendency to do that, and it will all seem, this will make, I think, more sense. This like public brawling will make more sense because you will understand where people are coming from. You'll factor that in. No one will be expressing disbelief. But I wonder, in your area of study, that Amazon story was interesting because it was both deeply reported, but also a piece of criticism, and written as a piece of criticism. And when you sort of delineate between negative criticism and constructive criticism, I wonder where the critical parts of that story fall in your judgment.
Yeah, so a couple things. One, I think just on the topic of this being a good thing, it's also driving traffic. Like, controversy drives traffic, and so, you know, those numbers that the New York Times is getting from that is, you know, it's hard to argue with that. In terms of criticism versus opinion versus kind of how to frame all of it, right? Like to Julia's point, getting called out for saying you're providing opinions by being critical. I think there's got to be place for the kind of investigative side of it, and also the kind of opinionated, here's an alternative to what exists right now, and what if we wanted this instead of that? And I think a lot of that has to do with the platform for where that gets published, right? Like, if it's an op-ed that Zeynep is writing for the New York Times, or if it's, you know, showing up in ProPublica. And there was one other thing, but
We're out of time. I think one good thing about this Amazon episode is it's becoming clearer and clearer to journalists that if everyone is attacking your story online, there's a good chance something's wrong with it, and you have to say something. And that whole idea of we stand by our story and just ignoring what happens when criticism comes in is kind of going away, and it deserves to go away because, as my friend Dan Gilmore says, my readers know more than I do. Sarah, John, Julia, thank you very much, and we are concluded.